This interview is being held on July 23, 2018 in Arlington, Texas. I am Penny Galt, and I'm a member of Mary Asham Keith Chapter, National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. I will be interviewing Franklin Kurt Tauzel. Also in attendance is Sonia Starnes, a member of Mary Asham Keith. Kurt, I noticed that you have some memorabilia that you have here. If you would mind just telling us about it?
Sure. Well, it's all started in West Virginia University. I flew in ROTC. They gave me the opportunity to get my private pilot license. And on the hilly terrain, it was fun in Morgantown, West Virginia, learning how to fly because your emergency landings were treetops. But anyhow, so I started off flying there and graduated from West Virginia and went to pilot training. Started off in Craig Air Force Base, Selma, Alabama. And that was an interesting time following on the heels of Martin Luther King marching through Selma. But we had a great time flying at Craig. I started off flying there in 1966 and the weather got very bad. Selma had a lot of trouble with clouds and rain. So I was behind the timeline because of the weather conditions there. And this T-38 that I'm holding was very sensitive to ice in the air. The engines would come apart because it had no de-icing, anti-icing. So I started at Craig, finished up in Lubbock, Texas at Reese Air Force Base where my wife Laura was attending tech and didn't know it. But I finished up there and I flew the T-38 supersonic trainer, and from there went into service flying and training in the B-52, which is the aircraft here. And I flew it, went to training in Castle, but I'll reflect more on that later on. But the this is the symbol on the top of the hat, and then the wings, the Air Force pilot wings, and this thing here, we had names on there. They had Velcro on it in combat so you could tear it off quickly if you were captured. But in the B-52, I was awarded these 5 oak leaf clusters to the Air Force Combat Medal, and it's kind of generic. They award it very, based on heroism and accomplishments under extreme situations. The Distinguished Flying Cross I'm very proud of. It was awarded on July 4th in Vietnam. Actually was flying the C-47, we called it the Electric Goon, but it was a reconnaissance aircraft, and a mission there that I supported calling in airstrikes on protection of our troops on the ground. And then this Air Force Commendation Medal is, I'm proud of it, reflected on the service I gave in the wing. I was an instructor pilot, evaluation pilot, and worked with the general there doing things, but this reflects on the extra work and dedication that I gave as a pilot in the 20th Bomb Squadron, 7th Bomb Wing. So that's the Air Force Commendation Medal. But these other items in here, these are the old badges and patches. This is the Bombardment Wing, and I was in the 20th Bomb Squadron. It's got a historic background to it, and the C-47, this is a picture of me in Saigon, Tan Son Nhut Air Base when I was flying it. We had flak vest and carried a pistol, which was not much protection. That's the only thing we had on board. But the C-47, we sat on the flak vest because a lot of guys got shot in the rear end. So that was our protection. But most of the others are patches in recognition of my service. But that wraps it up with the memorabilia.
Okay. Well, let's start with a little biographical information. When were you born?
I was born on March 15, Ides of March, 1943, in Washington, Pennsylvania.
Okay. What was your father's name?
Frank Ralph Tauzel.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
My
your mother?
mother, Julia Dorothy Tauzel. And I was born on the sofa on McLean Farm Road. I guess it was a sofa, but maybe on the floor. But Dr. Wilson drove right up to the front porch in the yard, parked, and proceeded to deliver me. So
Well,
I have two sisters.
Are they older or younger?
They're older.
They're
Yeah,
older.
they about 7 to 8 years older. And my dad was disappointed he did not have a son. So 7, 8 years later, I was born,
Well,
and he was quite happy.
I'm
So,
sure he was.
and it usually daughters are the big work in the family, and they did take care of my mother, but he was happy that I could carry on and do the work.
Right. Exactly.
So-
What did your father do for a living?
Well, he owned a concrete block company, and there was a lot of dust associated with it, and he smoked a lot of cigarettes, developed lung cancer, and same time period John Wayne had his lung removed. My dad had a lung removed, but then it basically overcame him because of breathing deficiency, and so he died of lung cancer. And my mother lived to 92, and at 84 she had a bypass and a heart valve put in, and lived another 8 years.
Oh,
So we always called her the Energizer Bunny because she just kept on going. She had some other operations, but she was an energetic lady, and she had the incidence of the heart problems in 1984. All the kids and us were going to visit at Thanksgiving, and she did all the yard work. She went out and tried to start the lawnmower and couldn't start it. Crank, crank, crank. Finally, she got a hard time breathing, called my sister, and that's when they developed or discovered
oh my
that
goodness.
she had heart problems.
Well, she was a hard worker.
Yes, she was, yeah.
And do you and Laura have children?
Yes, we have two boys, Adam Kurt Tauzel and Alexander Allen Tauzel. They both live nearby, and they have each two children, 2 boys and 2 girls. And we're happy and blessed with those, and
Yes, you are.
enjoy those times together.
Right. Did either of your sons go into the military?
No, I'm a little disappointed with that, but they are, in appearance, would always be judged as looking military. So, thank goodness, they always had short hair and clean cut, and they still are, and but they can be mistaken for soldiers.
Well, that's not bad. That's
No.
not a bad thing. What were you doing before you entered the military?
Well, it's funny that when I was in high school graduating, 1961, a very good friend of mine, and he and I decided we were going to join the Army on the buddy plan. You got the same assignment and whatever, so we went out and did the examinations and everything, and we had a bus ticket. And on the day that we were supposed to show up, neither of us showed up. So Charlie, he went on to be president of a company with no college, and did very good. He was just a very accomplished person without any college, and that's testament to people that they don't necessarily need an education. But for me, I started off in college, and my second year my father died, so I ended up taking a little break, but I went back, paid for my way through college, working sometimes 3 jobs a day. But during that time I went to West Virginia University, and it was a land-grant college, so you had to spend 2 years in the military, in the ROTC. So I participated in that, and I kind of enjoyed it, and it was Air Force ROTC. And looking ahead to the senior guys in the program, some of them were going off and taking flying lessons at the airport. The Air Force was paying for it. So I majored in advertising and journalism, have a degree in journalism, which is good or bad today, but anyhow, nonetheless, West Virginia was a very good journalism school, and at that time it was all print and a little bit of media, but no television or anything like it is today. So I became the advertising manager of the school newspaper, which was a daily 8 to 10 page paper. It was quite large in the U.S. But so I did that and was in ROTC. After 2 years, I had to make a commitment to continue on, and I did. I enjoyed it. I thought it was going to be interesting, and it gave me an opportunity to be an officer in the Air Force. And I took a test, whether it was to be I call them a ground pounder in the Air Force, or a navigator or a pilot, and I excelled on the pilot test. So they gave me that opportunity to proceed in that direction, and I took flying lessons. ROTC, the Air Force paid for it at the airport there locally, and I got that accomplished. And at graduation, because I graduated with honors academically, and I did very well in the military courses and such, and they recognized me for that, and they gave me a distinguished military graduate recognition, which at that time was not regularly done. So nationwide, at that time, there were not many. But being a distinguished military graduate, I entered the Air Force as a regular officer, equal and equivalent to an academy graduate. So when I went in, throughout my career, I had a regular Air Force serial number or member number, and that helped me to a little bit of influence and assignments and getting things done. So at West Virginia, I got that recognition, and as a side note, I wrote a paper at that time for the military department there on the military potential of communist China, and that was the sleeping giant statement that I titled it, and there wasn't much resources available to get background material, but I went to Pittsburgh and University of Pittsburgh and whatever, and gathered all this and wrote a 50-page report that's interesting reading today in comparison. Today their technology, back then they were foot soldier based. But so when I graduated as a regular officer, that's when I entered the Air Force, and in that position they cannot terminate you unless you do some violation. So I was a career officer, and that's what it was regarded. So that's when I got an assignment to Craig, and then continued on at Reese. And do you want me to continue on?
Yes, certainly. Did you have to go through, my husband tells me one's basic and one's boot camp. One's basic training, one's boot camp, but I don't know which is which.
During college, before I graduated, and I was commissioned a lieutenant when I graduated the day of, and raised my hand. During one summer, I went to Langley Air Force Base for a officers candidate school training, and it was in July, and it maybe was not as hot as it is today, but it was a lot of pressure with the heat and marching and calisthenics, and I had an interesting trick. Every morning we had to rise, and we had a few minutes to get ready to go, and one of the things was to be prepared for a daily inspection of your clothes, and everything had to be perfectly folded and creased, and the bed made up. So we, and along with others, discovered a little trick that we took safety pins, and before we went to bed, we safety pinned all the sheets in position. So we didn't have to make the bed in the morning. You just didn't have the time. so everything was safety pinned, and except one morning I woke up, I scratched my finger, and I had blood on the sheets.
Oh, no.
A little bit of cut.
Oh, no.
So I had to make this stinking thing, But yeah, that, and you had to eat square and drink. And one of the interesting things is they withheld salt from us there. They probably couldn't do it today, but they said afterwards that withholding salt affected your judgment and decision making and personality. So some things came out that maybe you would have in combat under stress. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it was true, but it was an interesting experience.
It is interesting.
Yeah, they had no salt and pepper on table, but maybe that goes back to Army cooking, you know, that chefs are good and always need salt. But anyhow, that was an interesting experience. So that was officers training, and then that entitled me to be an officer and on commissioning. But again, I was real proud of being inducted as a regular officer, and I got that special serial number, if you would describe it, and that was unique always. But I never really wanted to be like an Air Force Academy graduate, though. But that, along with being a fighter pilot, really distinguished your personality. But I was always an easygoing and got along with everybody. But so after university there and graduation, I began the crew combat training on the B-52 in California at Castle Air Force Base, and went through that training program, and they were training us in the B-52G and H, which are the models that are still flying today. I think they're flying the G today, the H is parked, but this was a very nice, sophisticated airplane in relation to the airplanes I flew with Delta Airlines, but the airplanes technically were very good. So how did I get an assignment to B-52s? At that time, I think there were 40 guys in my graduating class in pilot training, and it was one of the heights of Vietnam War where they were needing pilots. So you basically had two routes to go. There were 40, well, nationwide there were many assignments, but for my group at Reese, we had like 40 assignments, and we could, based on your class standing, you could pick the choices, and a lot of guys, and most of them wanted to be fighter pilots. So out of the 40, there were probably 2 fighters, and we had captains, recycled captains that went through pilot, maybe were navigators or otherwise, and went through pilot training. And they always got the best ERs and grades and everything, so they got first choice, and they would typically take the F-100 or F-4. But then it went down to maybe a back seat of an F-4, and
what is an F-4?
F-4 Phantom. It was a fighter, two-engine fighter. Yeah. Okay. Used a lot during Vietnam, but the back seat, you basically, some of them didn't even have controls. They just sat there as an electronic warfare officer and observers. So they watched the front seat guy fly the missions, but it was not a choice assignment because you were kind of a back seat guy. So then it went down to jets, and they had the tankers, KC-135s and the C-130s, and then the B-52s. And from there, the lower half actually were reciprocating engine kinds to Vietnam, directly from pilot training into a recip job. And it was like the C-47 EC. They had AC and EC. The AC was a gunship, the EC was electronic reconnaissance. And then they had Caribous, A-1Es, and the Bird Dogs, A-1, I forget the title and description, but those guys flew at treetops, and it was not a good job for longevity. But so usually half of the assignments would go to the recips in Southeast Asia. So I figured this assignment on the B-52 was to Homestead Air Force Base when I had an apartment in Coral Gables, and it was cush compared to Tonsalud or Quezon or Da Nang or whatever. So I was able to stay in a jet. And so I went to Homestead. They ended up closing the base there shortly after arrival because that was on the heels of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the B-52s were 15, 20 minutes from dropping a bomb. So in the interim, I went to Fort Worth. They had a nuclear weapons school, and there we learned all about nuclear bombs and handling and the management and the crew safety procedures and such. And it was 2 or 3 weeks long. It was quite intense, and I learned more than I wanted to know about a bomb. They showed us schematics and the safety on there, but it was very impressive how it made you comfortable carrying 4 of them in the back of the bomber. So there are a lot of safety steps, you know, in order to activate, detonate, drop, or whatever. So I ended up in Homestead, and they closed the base, and lo and behold, I went into personnel to get my orders to go somewhere. And usually from the south, you went north to Minot, North Dakota, or somewhere cold. So I went into personnel, and there was the chief master sergeant from West Virginia University. And we befriended each other again, and he said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "I don't know." He was going to give me anything I wanted. Well, I could have gone to March Air Force Base in B-52s, or the unit, the squadron, 20th Bomb Squadron, was planning to move from Barksdale to Fort Worth Carswell Air Force Base. So he said, "That would be a great assignment. You'll love Fort Worth." So sure enough, I did. I got orders there, and I had a few months off. I visited an uncle in Michigan and went to Bahamas. I had a good time. He said, "If anything happens to you, I'll sign you out on leave, and you'll be medically and insured." So he took care of me, fine, you know. So anyhow, I showed up in Fort Worth on, I think maybe it was Labor Day weekend in the fall, August, September, whatever it was in that time. And I needed an apartment, so got my car and drove around Fort Worth and saw an apartment in University Gardens Apartments on University Drive. And at that time, it was a big complex and had several areas there and had different pools and swimming pools. So I found an apartment. They showed it to me. I took it and I moved in. And I thought, well, it was Labor Day weekend and everybody's outside romping, having fun by the pool. So I thought, that I got to get my bathing suit on. So I went out by the pool and walked around to find a place to sit down. Finally, this young, cute little girl in a bikini came up and said, "Hi, I'm Laura." So anyhow, that's the day and the time that I met Laura. And she said, "Would you like some iced tea?" And I said, "Don't they have beer in Fort Worth, you know?" And so anyhow, she was having a controversy with her roommate that said, "No beer for strangers this weekend." She marched in and got me a beer, and boy, they had a cold look at each other. So anyhow, that's when I met her, and we dated for several years, and coming and going to Vietnam. In the B-52, we'd go over 6 months at a time. 189-day orders for 189 days. 190 would have been a permanent change, and then you could only have 2 of those during an active or that time period. So they pulled the smooth move of giving us orders for 189 days. So we would go over 6 months and come back 6 months. But during the time at Carswell, I had the good fortune, and whatever they picked me to be on the senior crew at the base, which in the B-52 we gave all the check rides, and we were the one that rode with the IG for inspections and whatever, so we had to be the top quality guys. And when the simulator, sometimes it was on a train, it came to town, I gave check rides on emergency procedures and instructed the pilots. And so being on the senior crew, I liked it too. We only pulled 40% of nuclear alert.
Now,
That nuclear alert was an interesting experience. That they had a building that was mostly underground at Carswell, and we had a ramp outside that was very close, and we all had assigned vehicles that we could drive to, and and they had the klaxon. We had a lot of drills. But in the event of a conflict, you've heard of DEFCONs and whatever, but should we have had to launch all the way to target, well, before we went on alert, we studied all day on targeting sites, what our target was. And each crew member and each airplane had a target, and we had maps. We had to brief on it almost by memory of what to do and how to do it to reach that target. And so it was interesting being on alert in there that you always that klaxon would sound and it all run to the airplane, and there were different degrees. Sometimes, and we had these cacks. I don't know. They were called a cax, but it was this whole chest of cards that the message you would get. You write it down. Two pilots would write it, not two pilots, but a pilot, usually electronic warfare officer, would write it down. We'd go into there, and we had sliding things that would show different numbers in there, and then you'd get the message of what the numbers should read, and that's how you could be launched all the way to the target that way, or you could be launched just to say start engines in the place. Airplane was all pre-flighted, ready to launch, and the engines had these huge buckets of gunpowder on a couple of the engines, and they were attached to the starters. So when you got all in, you had to throw a few switches and do little last minute things. Then you hit those switches and it would shoot off this gunpowder that turned the engine very rapidly, and all you had to do was put the fuel on. So usually an engine starting, use pneumatic air, and the engine has to slowly wind up and get up to speed and then put the fuel on and you ignite it and you start it. Those things were just almost instantaneous to get your engine going. So you started those two and then you followed on and started. You had 8 engines, so it took a long time to start all those devils. But anyhow, as you progress through there, sometimes you might even start taxiing to the end of the runway. Now at that time, the Russians had submarines in the Gulf, and they were 15 minutes away. So our objective was to be airborne within the time that we learned, leave the bowling alley, the PX, wherever you were, get to the airplane, throw your stuff on, and start the engines, be airborne in less than 15 minutes if they launched one to Fort Worth. And General Dynamics in Fort Worth, Carswell were the supposed prime targets. So we would launch. The closest I ever got to launching was sitting at the end of the runway with all the engines running, all those bombers and tankers and everything sitting there. And we had practice not being launched by the DEFCON or the mission. But the B-52s would take just seconds apart. The first one goes straight ahead, the second one right, the third one to the left. And it was just a black cloud of smoke because those generations of engines were not very clean. So it was an interesting experience to see and to do. But anyhow, sometime before I was in there, they actually, my companions there, they actually used to launch them and go on alert over the Hudson Bay, and they had tankers up there, and they would launch you and be on alert for 24 hours instead of on the ground in Fort Worth, and you were loaded with nuclear bombs, different sizes. The ones I remember, we always carried 8 4 megaton nuclear bombs, and the inside the B-52. Well, the bottom was painted white so that the radiation wouldn't hurt it, but inside we wore gold goggles, and we had the windows were shielded with foil protection so that the flash wouldn't burn up. Depending on how close you were, you could either get thrown out of the air or burned up on the bottom or whatever. But we had a mission, and we planned that if we dropped the bomb, most everything I remember was we recovered in Turkey at Incirlik, and if we survived the attack. Now you have to keep in mind that we were the B-52 wave. They had other nuclear bombers that were going to attack similarly, as well as ICBMs. So I always envisioned these nuclear bombs going off everywhere, and the flashes were harmful, but anyhow, it's what you had to do, I guess, at the time. I was dedicated to the mission, never balked at being there, and so that was I think something that the Air Force was good in picking individuals that would stick to the mission. I know we have some like that today there, but on the ground, civilians, there's an awful lot that would just fight at that. But I was a nuclear bomber pilot, primarily during my B-52 time.
And this was what period, what time period was this?
Well, 1968 to 70.
Okay, so this was still during the Vietnam War?
Yeah.
That
Oh,
all
yeah.
this was.
Yeah, yeah. So we would go, we would sit on alert 6 months, then go to Vietnam 6 months. And before we went to Vietnam, while in country, we would have a briefing on nuclear bombing while in Vietnam. And some of it included targeting Hanoi. And so we were prepared to launch and go to that area and bomb nuclear at Hanoi. And that was always interesting to me that our government withheld the opportunity to end the war today, but I don't think it ever got that bad. But still, we were trained, ready. We had maps. We had, they call it fragged, but we'd have had to have been launched, same thing, and set on alert, and it had to load bombs and all that. But normally we carried 108 500-pound bombs, and that conventional bombing, that H model flew it. It was technically advanced, but it was not equipped at that time. Today it is to carry conventional bombs. It was a nuclear bomber. So when we went over there, we had a nice airplane at Carswell. It was the F model. It was clean, had low time, and I actually flew them to Tucson, Arizona, to the boneyard and mothballed them. And that was bad. And then we went home and we saw what they were giving us, which was the D model, and it had wrinkled sides and twice the flying time, and pneumatically driven generators and all sorts of challenges that to keep the airplane in the air. Everything was pneumatic driven, pretty much. Pressurization, heating, air conditioning, and the starters and everything. So we flew that in Vietnam, and it was a conventional bomber that was engineered to carry a lot of bombs and go. But so the orders were to go to Guam, primarily in the beginning, the first year that I went over first tour. And from Guam, it was like a 12-hour flight, round trip. And we would go 3 hours before. We'd sign in maybe at 9 o'clock, pre-flight the airplane, go to operations, get study the target area and the procedures and whatever, reminded of what was going on. Would go to the airplane and would get ready. And at that time, 6 airplanes, they called it, a wave of 6, and each flight had 3 aircraft. So they prepared for 6 airplanes being launched. And the last I read, I forget statistics, but they had like 100% launch during Vietnam. And at one time we had 150 B-52s at Guam. And we would go out to the airplane, and they had 9 aircraft that were ready to launch, although we were only going with 6. And we'd go out and do our pre-flight, and if you discovered something during the pre-flight that might have prevented you from launching, we'd run to another airplane that another crew had pre-flighted, ready to start engines. So they had them all ready, all 9. So several times I've got it. In fact, at the end of the runway, you'd go out and taxi. You might sit there for 30 minutes waiting for takeoff. And if anybody had a problem, we'd taxi back, get on another airplane, and go back and join the flight. So the first 3 aircraft were prepared to take off, and out of Guam, it was an exciting adventure. We were always up pretty much max gross weight, although not enough fuel to get to Vietnam and back. So we would take off, and the first 2/3 of the runway was downhill, and the last third was uphill. And at the end was a 600-foot cliff. So we would take off, and you're sitting there waiting for the fella in front of you to take off, and he would launch through the black smoke and what have you, and he would disappear. Well, when the gear doors on a B-52 opened up, they were dragged. So the pilot would descend after takeoff, just for a better margin of error, to retract the gear. So he'd go out of sight, and then pretty soon you'd see the black smoke coming out of it, and over the beach. And on our days off, they had a beach there, Taragi Beach, and we'd go there and would watch the airplanes take off. But we would launch usually in dark, so that we would target at sunrise or close before it, so we would catch the enemy off guard. But every bit of B-52 bombing was done in darkness. So we'd take off, we'd climb up, and it took 30 minutes to get to altitude and that thing at that weight. So we'd get up and would fly for a couple of hours, and along about the Philippines would what they call hit a tanker, and we'd let them pass gas. Yes, we joked. And so they would hit a tanker and would air refuel, and sometimes that took almost an hour, because the last thousands of pounds were going into a tank that was very restrictive and slow. So it was a grueling maneuver, especially at night. You hit the tanker at night, and it could be bumpy, it could be cloudy, or whatever.
Now, tanker, is this another airplane?
Yeah,
is this what you see?
KC-135.
They have the long hose, whatever the hooks
Yeah,
in. Okay,
yeah.
okay.
That was civilian, that was a Boeing 707.
Okay.
So if you can picture a B-52 and a Boeing 707 within 30 feet of each other, refueling, and the hose or the boom had some flexibility in back and everything, but I've seen it, if you get too far, it detaches and disconnects, and then you'd have to go back up and hit it again. But it was a procedure, and the navigators, they had, each airplane had a beacon on it, and the radar navigator from some distance out, and we were at safe altitude separating it, would close on it, and he could say turn left 2 degrees or 1 degree, and he would navigate us up until we got visual, and then the pilots would take over and go up, and you were talking to the boom operator. Pretty much was a safety person in there, that he would say I see you, you know, and whatever. And the two pilots up front on the KC-135, their goal was to keep it flying level and smooth, and speed, just a microscopic movement of the throttles would adjust forward and back. So at that time, you know, you'd maneuver up behind the tanker and you'd unload the fuel. And again, the initial unload began, it was fast, and you would get the fuel. But you had to get the fuel, because we would take off, I think with like 230,000 pounds of fuel, and we would fly the mission, would unload 100,000 pounds, that's 330,000 pounds of fuel, that's 7 pounds a gallon. So with that fuel, we would come back, we were planning on landing back in Guam with 20,000 pounds. So it was a close margin, and the Guam weather could be rainy, cloudy, or whatever, but there was a safety net built in there that coming back, if we had a problem or something, or whatever, we needed fuel, we could get a tanker, secondary tanker. They came out of Okinawa, and they were at the ready in the air to meet us if we needed a tanker, but I can't remember that ever being necessary, but out of hundreds of missions. But so we would get our fuel and proceed to the target. And I always laugh thinking about this, that you learn how to fly an airplane, and over the combat area, flying the airplane was incidental. You never thought about it. There were so many tasks to do that keeping the airplane in the air and airspeed and time and heading and whatever, you had to coordinate approaching the country. You had to coordinate the drop zone and get approvals, and at that time the communication, you had to worry about people capturing in the frequency and giving false instructions and everything. So we had all these communication procedures to prevent that. and that was time consuming and slow doing the communication. But we would get talk to the bomb drop guy, and would get, well, even before that, you had to get Air Force approval, and I don't know all the chain of command, but whoever was tasked to drop the bombs on that, each one drop was considered critical, and mainly to the safety of the troops on the ground, because you had about a 1x2 bomb drop zone, but you might have had a 5-mile protection area that you had to get going backwards through the chain of command. The guys on the ground would confirm that they're clear of the drop zone, and then you'd have to get approvals, and then as you got closer, it even became more critical of getting all the approvals necessary to drop continued. So as we got approval, I was on the senior crew. I was always in the lead aircraft of the wave in the flight. So we would have to coordinate, communication-wise, you had to coordinate in the cockpit with the ground controllers, on the target zone, and the communication was just crazy, and that's why flying the airplane was incidental. You had to just be capable of keeping the airplane in the air, whatever, but which was natural after a time. But so we would get approval to drop the bombs, and people on the ground confirmed that we were okay. And dropping 108 pound of bombs, or 108 bombs, they had what they called a DASK, D-A-S-K, drift angle station keeping, and each airplane had a beacon on it that was followed by the other radar navigators that would leave a blip on his screen, so he knew where they were relative, and we're usually about 500 feet altitude separation, so if anybody messed up, we didn't run into the next guy. But for a fighter pilot, he would laugh at that because they flew maybe 10 or 20 feet apart, but here we are, 500 feet separation, and it was, I don't know, I forget the exact, but it might have been a half-mile spacing between the first half-mile of the second, half-mile again on the right, but each one flew 1,000 feet or so to the right and left of lead. So lead did all the navigating. Our radar navigator tried to put us right down the middle of the drop zone, which again was a mile by 2 miles or so, and then when we passed over, one of the pilots would say bombs away, and the other aircraft would have to coordinate and make sure they were on the frequency so they could hear, and they were ready to hear that bombs away. When they did, they started a stopwatch, and then they'd calculate so many seconds behind the lead bomb drop, and the second guy would start bombs away, and then the third guy behind, after a certain time that they calculated, would drop. And the idea was the lead to go down the middle of the target zone on the left 500 feet and the other one 500 feet or so over here. And that developed a technique where they discovered that instead of being explosions, it was an implosion. And what it did was it created a vacuum in there, and I won't describe what it did to the people in the tunnels, but it was effective on tunnel, their protection. They used a tunnel for them, but creating that vacuum was deathly. So that became effective, the style of bomb dropping, conventional bombs. So then I did many, it was funny going into Cambodia. We weren't supposed to be there and supposed to do it, and they'd be screaming at us on the radio. We had general frequencies, and then we had target frequencies and stuff, and they'd be hollering at us, "You're entering no-fly zone, you're entering Cambodia," but we would just press on and go in there and drop the bombs and get out of there. But up north, up near kind of Beam, Hanoi, we would fly toward North Vietnam, and as soon as we dropped, B-52 would go into a 55-degree bank and get the heck out of there and turn around and do a 180. And at that time, we did a BDA, bomb damage assessment, and you could see fuel depots and things exploding on the ground and would record that. But during that time, there'd be the Vietnamese, North Viet Cong, they didn't want to turn on the radar on their surface-to-air missiles because as soon as it popped on, we had an F-105 fighter aircraft, or RB-66s, in the area that would nail that and fix that and call in an airstrike immediately on that position. And so they were careful not to turn it on, but their answer was, we'd fly 30 to 35,000 feet on the missions, and in the dark, we'd turn all our beacons off and all the on-site lighting off, and we would go over the target, and their answer was to just salvo SAMs. And we were a little high for AAA, anti-aircraft artillery, but the SAMs, they had them set to detonate at 30 or 35,000 feet. So they were like a telephone pole, and I've seen them flying, and they would go into that bank, and they'd be launching them, and you know, luckily at some distance away, the EWO, the electronic warfare officer, would say, you know, launch, incoming, whatever I forget the term, but you just prayed and hoped that your turn was effective. But and we also had a maneuver of doing steep S-turns, and that was effective. But we did get shot at, and there were some B-52s, one from Carswell, that got shot down, and it happened on the day that Laura's grandfather retired. And so she was worried about who it was from the crew there. But so anyhow, we would drop the bombs and get the heck out of there and recover and kind of take a deep breath. And this was a different story when I was flying the electric goon, the EC-47, because we were down almost treetops. There we got AAA anti. I'll tell the story about the goon in a minute, my duty there. But in the B-52, we'd go back and recover at Guam, and we had at least a 6-hour flight, and we sometimes launched into sunset and arrived back at sunrise, and 12 hours later, and that was about the mission. But we'd debrief again for an hour and a half, and take our stuff in, and we'd go down to a little area that had sold beer, and would debrief, as they quoted, you know, with a beer. And there I always remember we had there was a cage. I think the mechanics, the B-52 mechanics had a cage that had a boa constrictor in it. And they would place a chicken in there. And so we wagered and had pick a time and day when the boa was going to get the chicken. And so usually the chicken would sleep on its back or sit up there on the back of the snake, and then you know, as soon as that boa started moving, that chicken would get jittery. You could tell, you know, and pretty soon, you know, it would get it. So at that recorded time, they won the pot on gambling. So that was kind of a little bit of levity to the problem. Death all around, I guess you could say. But so we would debrief, and Guam didn't hold much insofar as sightseeing. It was 26 miles around, and Laura actually met me there on, she flew for American Airlines, and she flew the long flight to Guam. And at that time, we were on a mission. You know, we came back. She's going to be there a few days, and the mission was during a storm in the area there, hurricane. They call them, I don't know, something different in the Pacific. But here we got recovered in Okinawa instead of Guam, and so here she was there. So our friend Norm Walsh at my navigator, he had kind of courted her and was communicating with his wife in Fort Worth and all that. We used HF. Barry Goldwater had a communication system set up from Phoenix that allowed us to call on HF, and it was very nice. What
is HF?
High frequency communication. And that's where you had to say, hi Kurt, over. And if you forgot, some guy would come on and say, slap your wrist, But anyhow, so Laura was there, and good part of the time I was in Okinawa. And when she showed up in there and everything, she had a motel, and a motel room there, and everybody around there were honeymooners from Japan, and they were all more than a foot shorter than her. So she said she was walking around. But anyhow, then the funny thing is too, is when she got there and went into the room, she took a shower, she got undressed, and we got in the shower, and she looked up on the ceiling, and there were about half a dozen of geckos, true geckos, not anoles we got here, but geckos. She screamed bloody murder and ran outside the room with just a small towel into the ground. But I guess there were some people there, but anyhow, she just, took off. So anyhow, that was a fun experience. And then another time I guess when I was in the C-47, we met in Hawaii for R&R. But to talk about my crew, we had flew with several standardization pilots, but Don Thede comes to mind. He looked like a teddy bear, big bushy eyebrows, and radar navigator was Norm Walsh, who's living in Fort Worth now, and he looked like Walter Matthau. And we're doing okay on time?
We're fine.
So Walter Matthau, and quite hilarious and fun, and my navigator was Bob McGraw from he lives in Dallas now, and he's got kids over there and lives in a $10 million house in Highland Park. And so he took over Dad's business, did very well, but he was a wonderful singer. He sang at our wedding in Fort Worth, but anyhow, he was a great guy. So we had the best navigators, radar navigators, pilots on the senior crew. And we did a good job and got the mission accomplished, and set the example for everybody else and took care of problems if anything occurred. But that B-52 was squarely in flight, speaking about saving people. You had a very small envelope in flight. When we came back, we might go up to 41,000 feet, and most of the crew would fall asleep except for one pilot, and that was normal. And but that one pilot was tasked with staying awake. And one thing in the airline business, they said the worst thing you can see is, as the captain, when you wake up to see that your co-pilot is sleeping. So anyhow, there were some incidents that happened with other crews that you either pull a power back a little bit if you look down, flying visually when everybody was sleeping. You look down and you pull a power back, like in response, knee jerk, and the airplanes would get behind the power curve, and when you added power, nothing would happen. It was an antique engine. But anyhow, that's one war story. But so we landed, and then from there, do you want me to continue with C-47?
However you want to tell.
Yeah. So I enjoyed my time on B-52s. I spent 3. They called them arc-light tours to Vietnam, bombing, and then again domestically we sat on nuclear alert. But when I finished that task or that assignment, I knew orders were coming down. 2 other academy guys, regular officers, who had no scheduled date of separation. So you were at the mercy of Air Force personnel in San Antonio. And a couple of those guys said that they were warned that they might get an assignment that they didn't want to take. So they put their papers in to get out. And the funny thing about it, airlines were not answering letters or inquiring at all. There was a flood of pilots on the market, and the airlines business was down. So 3 of us went, put our papers in to get out. When I was working for the Deputy Chief of Operations, and when it came across his desk, he was quite upset. And so anyhow, I endured that wrath, and he was a nice fellow. Went on to be high up in the Omaha in the Strategic Air Command. His name was Burkhardt. Anyhow, he got me orders. A little side story. When I was in college, I dated a girl from West Virginia that went to secretarial school, Catherine Gibbs in Boston. And she got her biology degree and couldn't get a job, so she did that. And she ended up in New York as the personal secretary to Ed Nixon, Richard Nixon's brother. He was president of, or vice president of IT&T in New York. So when Nixon got nominated or elected, when he got elected, he was tasked with being the, well, before that, he was the Eastern Campaign Coordinator. He asked Sarah to go and be his assistant. So she did, and she traveled around the country as a lead person and set up things. Well, when Nixon got elected, she was tasked with being the coordinator during the inaugural ceremonies of the Nixon family, accommodations and all the visitations and whatever. And so she invited me to be her escort. So it came down pretty high up. I got orders to go to Washington to be her escort. And I went to all the inaugural ceremonies, all 7 inaugural balls. But the best thing was is that since she was with the Nixon family, we rode on buses and we sat in the front seat. In the performances, we sat in the front row, and it was exceptional. I've got all kind of memorabilia, but later on, when I was flying as a pilot with Delta Airlines, I had a lot of layovers in Washington, D.C., and I would go. She worked in the White House for, I don't know, 25 years, through several presidents, and I would march right up to the main gate in the White House and then walk that driveway and go into the White House. And she had an office next to Kissinger at that time, and, you know, she'd show me around different things. Later, Laura, she invited Laura, and we would go, Laura, and take the kids. We had firsthand, when Reagan would be in California, we had the run of the White House, and we have fabulous pictures of that event. But anyhow, so that was my side story, that I got orders to go to the inauguration at that time, good, bad, or ugly. But, you know, I liked Nixon all the time, and Laura and I drove by Watergate while we were in the DAR convention. Interesting, they even refer to it now. But, okay, so the Air Force, when I put my papers in, they knew you were not going to be a regular officer forever. So I got my orders. After that, within a week, I was in Alexandria, Louisiana, learning how to fly the C-47, which was a wonderful experience, quite unusual. I was a tail dragger. It was this last weekend down in Austin. They took off and crashed and burned one. There's a tail dragging wheel on the back, and I'm sure he forgot to lock it. And when he did, he veered off a runway and turned over and burned. But it's a danger on there. But so here I was, 30 days training in Alexandria, Louisiana, England Air Force Base, to fly that. And then 6 weeks later, I was in jungle survival in the Philippines. So it was fun. And that was an interesting experience. I've got some lengthy stories about that, but we'll not go into that. But anyhow, so we're out in the jungle with the Aborigines, and and then I went on en route to Saigon. I was assigned to the Tactical Electronics Warfare Squadron there, and that did electronic reconnaissance, and it had exotic navigation, Doppler navigation for an antique airplane, and in fact, we called it the Antique Airlines, but in the back end we had sophisticated radio equipment. We always felt they were with the CIA. They never wore rank, and they were friendly and talk, but not a lot. And so we would fly those guys around, and I was a captain then, and another good friend of mine who was the best man in our wedding, Mike Lynch, he and I ended up being assigned as the squadron instructors and evaluators, giving check rides and in-country orientation to a bunch of first lieutenants just out of pilot training, as I described, that if you were unfortunate enough to get that assignment, here they were, the last airplane they flew was a supersonic T-38. Now they're in this 2-engine Gooney and that was fun, teaching them the ins and outs of the mission. But they usually flew co-pilot for a long time, but I'd give them instrument check rides at Vung Tau along the coast, and the crosswinds are always horrendous there. And boy, they were all over Earth, you know, trying to find a runway. So anyhow, that was an interesting experience. But we were, as the designated line check pilot, instructor, evaluator, he and I, Mike, we had our own private airplane that we parked under the tower right at Tonsanut, because it had no secret equipment in the back end. So if something happened or we had to go anywhere to pick up a crew, we didn't have the secret equipment in the back. So we parked it, and we would do a couple extra duties. We'd fly airplanes to Nakhon Phanom, which is on the China border up north near Laos, and it was in Thailand. But we'd go up there and fly airplanes. They made a movie about a C-47. There was a mountain range there, and you had to have extra powerful engines than what we flew in Tonsanut, in Saigon. If you get over the mountain losing the engine, you can't get back. So anyhow, we made sure everything was running good when we went, and so we would deliver airplanes there, and that base at Nakhon Phanom, NKP they called it, was like going to a Boy Scout camp. It was redwood-like things, had no glass in the windows, had louvered windows, and very resort camp-like. And so it was great. And there was a CIA building, 4-story modern, looked like in Arlington, right there, that was the headquarters, I think, for intelligence gathering from things coming out of Hanoi. They were monitoring things too, you know. And, but so it was there. But so the fact that a lot of those different people lived there, the officers club there had the best entertainment in Southeast Asia. So we would go up there and enjoy that for a while. In the B-52, I didn't mention, but we flew out of missions out of Okinawa and also Utapao, Thailand, on the Gulf of Siam in Thailand, and that's right near where those kids were recently rescued. And anyhow, the Lara visited me in Bangkok also. That was during the C-47 assignment, and we went down to this Pattaya beach, which was very nice, and you read about it today. It's over touristy now, but she visited me there. And then we toured Bangkok, stayed at the Intercontinental Palace. It was a nice experience. And and Okinawa was nice too. What rang my bell with that is they had gambling in the officers club at Kadena, and a lot of big payouts, and they'd give free steak dinners a couple times a week, it seemed like, you know, for the amount of money they made. And the government never caught wind of that, but ended up eventually shutting it down. But so anyhow, the C-47, interesting thing, we flew over wilderness. I know every inch of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and part of Thailand, just like it was flying over Texas. You got, and you relied primarily on the radar navigator, but whenever we'd get done with the mission that we were going to do, I'd tell them to go to sleep and I'd fly home. Largest part of that visually, and then when we got within a couple hundred miles of Saigon, I would turn on AFVN, Armed Forces Vietnam Radio, you know, fame of the comedian.
Robin Williams.
Yeah, so, Hello America.
Yeah.
But anyhow, we listened to that, it had good music on it, and we had this non-directional beacon on it, and say non-directional, but it would toot it on there, and it would point to Saigon. So we just head that way until we recognized something, and then I'd communicate with, rivals. But at that time, Tan Son Nhut was the busiest airport in the world, and it had many on-ramps. So on the C-47 would line up and would launch, and one airplane go right, one left, one left, one right. And but then coming into Tan Son Nhut, of all places, is where we picked up most of the shells shooting. The people on the ground, small arms fire, when you're close, it had better penetration. And the fuel tanks on the wing of that C-47 had a material in it that prevented explosions and sealed leaks real quick. And that's primarily why we sat on our flak vest also. So we didn't get fire and explosions when they hit the tanks, but the ground guy, the mechanic, come up and say, "Captain, you know that you got bullet holes in the back." But it penetrated aluminum very easily, and so that's where we sat on our flak vest, and there was no foam. It was hard sitting. For our missions were about 8 hours in the C-47 and take off, and that was we had about 30 minutes of fuel left when we got done. But and there again, we flew out of Saigon to Phnom, and then the B-52. I forgot to mention, we flew out of Utapao, their air base. And that was a short 5-hour mission, bombing. But on the Goonie Bird, I did most of the flying out of out of Tan Son Nhut. And there, when I would ferry an airplane up to Nakhon Phanom, all these are funny names, NKP, we abbreviated them, but en route, we would fly over Phnom Penh, and then we'd do some sightseeing, because it was not a mission. And most interesting is we'd fly over that Siem Reap and Angkor Wat, the ruins out there, and we'd circle that for quite a while. And I've got videos of going around. Back then it was desolate. I mean, uninhabited, maybe except by lions, Bengal tigers, and so later on Jackie Kennedy went there and started the tourism business in that area. And they've cleaned it up and improved it, but I think they still have some terrorists there that don't like Americans. But so, all in all, I think in summary, I like most of the pilots, complained a lot when we were there. We did the mission, never complained about going to fly, never balked at it. It was our mission, it was our task, and never had orders. It was just assumed. But a lot of guys like myself, geez, we complain about being there, but looking back on it, it was a wonderful experience. So we did the job, I think, and I was happy and glad to do it, and honored to do it, and have the privilege to fly all these airplanes. But when I retired, Delta loaned me a $100 million airplane and go fly, and so it was nice. But some things happened after the war. Do you want me to continue with that? Certainly. Okay, so when I got done with my tour there, I had 3 tours of B-52 and 1 year they called a PCS in Tan Son Nhut at flying the C-47. So when I came back, my date of separation was going to be December the 15th. So I came back to Carswell. They returned me. The most easy way to do it is come back to Carswell and separate there. And I didn't have any job or anything. I just started looking for a job. Airlines were not answering any letters of interest in employment as a pilot. Now, when I graduated, I had pretty good credentials as the advertising manager of the paper. I was a national president of an advertising fraternity, society, and so I had some credentials and did good. So I wanted to work if the airlines weren't hiring, I wanted to work for an aviation-related company. So I applied at Cessna Aircraft. And in the interim, I am real happy and really just proud to say that Ross Perot and John Cornyn both were very interested in hiring and supporting veterans. So today I'm sure there are organizations that do it, but when I got out, Ross Perot offered me a job, and I went up in the team interview in the Frito-Lay building or whatever, maybe it was the EDS building then, but had a team interview. I remember going up the floor, and I wore my Ross like white shirts and black suits. Mm-hmm. So I had on my uniform, black suit and a white shirt and a tie, and went in this room. It was the most extraordinary experience I think I've had. I mean, being a pilot, you've got to go out and demonstrate emergency procedure knowledge and flying skills. But here, I was set down in the middle of this oval table with all these men in white shirts and suits, you know, and interviewed me. And asked you about, kind of like y'all are doing, only my feelings about this, that, and other. Now, I knew very, very little about computers. I mean, the inner workings or anything. But he offered me a job as a systems analyst. He had just gotten a contract in Pennsylvania with Blue Cross Blue Shield. But it was in, I forget, some obscure town in Pennsylvania that they were building their company headquarters for EDS. And he offered me a job there. And Laura and I thought long and hard about it. And I don't know, I was thinking of ambitions of flying, but yet still I was too stupid to realize the opportunity that I was turning down. But I sent a letter that no thank you. And the other one was a temporary. I think I eventually, my feelings then I forget, but I was probably thinking down the road about being an airline pilot. And that was a commitment that I probably had for a lifetime. And Ross, I really respect him for that, doing that. Mm-hmm. The other one was John Cornyn. He was running for an office, and he wanted me to be one of the front men with him. And he wanted that veteran GI look, you know. Mm-hmm. And that was nice, you know, but so I turned that down also. But in the meantime, I was communicating with Cessna Aircraft in Wichita. And they ended up hiring me, and I was the first non-Kansan in that corporate headquarters to be hired. Mm-hmm. And I never realized the impact of that, but anyhow, I was hired as the creative supervisor of advertising. And above me was an advertising manager, but I was tasked with writing all the copy and creating brochures for the aircraft. And they had 23 aircraft every year that they had to redo all of this for. And but I was pretty good with the written word, and being in journalism and advertising, the gift of gab and whatever it was with that in writing. But yet you had to be real simple and to the point, you know. So as a copywriter, I was pretty good. And so I got that great job. I was really happy with it. They gave me they allowed me to use free use of an airplane, brand new. And it was the highest performance single engine at that time, retractable gear, and it had, anyhow, it was a powerful aircraft. And so Laura and I would fly to Dallas, and it was fun we'd go flying around Lake of the Ozarks and everything in the evening, you know, and just buzz around and do that. And but the primary purpose of the airplane was to do air-to-air photography of the other aircraft. So Cessna at that time had hired a professional photographer that graduated. He went to Dartmouth and got a 4-year degree at Dartmouth, and then went to, Al Pitzner was his name, and he went on to a photography school in LA and got a 4-year degree there. So he was a professional photographer and very good at it. And Al was I don't know what you call him. He worked from midnight to 8 in the morning, primarily. And of course, I was happily married and wanted to be home, you know,
right.
Opposite that. So anyhow, I was creative supervisor. and director of photography. So we would get these aircraft and we would have to take pictures of them, and he just did spectacular work. He ended up doing that. He quit while he was working for me and went to work for he started a company, and he did all of Beech, all of Learjet, all of Cessna, and all sorts of things. I mean, Al was an extreme photographer. He had skied the Swiss Alps with a Bolin movie camera on a helmet. This is 1971 or 2, and he later on started his own studio and moved to Kansas City and invited me up there to see that. And he had robotic cameras from Switzerland that would take photographs, and he did all the Hochschild catalogs at that time, and they would put an object there, and it was really spectacular to see it. And so that was a side story to Cessna. But he and I won some awards with brochures. I told him, he liked to go to work very late and work very late, and I had this one airplane that Cessna had pressurized, and I wanted to get this image of up high in the sky. And I said, Al, evening photo shoots, the skies, I knew those skies and the cloud formations, they just don't portray a morning sky.
Right.
I said, we're going to have to get up at 4 or 5 in the morning and go fly and, take a picture of sunrise. And he had this we took the window out of the back of this airplane, and he had a 180-degree panoramic camera. It was revolutionary. And I get flying sideways, and he took these pictures. So when he got done, the images covered, we made the brochure extra wide, and it was this full panorama of a sunrise with this airplane superimposed that was dark image because the sunlight was behind it, and spectacular. So we won a lot of awards with that picture in that brochure. So Al, he was good. We had fun. Crazy. He in that studio I was visiting. I heard this helicopter overhead. Wop 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 wop. Tell you what kind of guy it was. And I said, Al, what's going on up there? He said, that's one of my workers, photographer's wife. She lays up there nude, and the police helicopters hover overhead anytime she's out there. So anyhow, but Cessna was good. So here comes along the airlines. A friend called me up and said, hey, Kurt, I just got hired by Delta. So you always keep your application in there. But since I had updated my flying, I never sent that in, any update on it. So I sent it in, the update on my application, and immediately got an interview and got hired right away. So being with Delta, I told the interviewer, it was an old crusty guy that was in the DC-3 generation. I said, I'd do this job for nothing. He said, don't tell anybody else. But flying was great. So I started my career with Delta Airlines, and started at it. I had to stay in Atlanta for a while, and then it was an era where they took advantage of the young guys, and I spent TDY in Boston a lot, and Miami, TDY, temporary duty. And anyhow, but that was interesting. And then eventually, after a year, we didn't like Atlanta, so Laura's folks were in Fort Worth, and so we moved to Dallas, and there we actually bought a house in Arlington, our first house, had it built, and then lived there for 5 or 6 years, and then found our home on the lake and lived there 37 years, and then downsized and moved here. So flying wise with Delta Airlines was an adventure, quite an experience. So I started off in a Convair 880, which was like a sports car Corvette, 4-engine. Elvis Presley ended up buying one of our airplanes when he retired. but it was a wonderful airplane. And then it went to 727. That's where everybody joked, if it ain't a Boeing, I ain't going, you know. And then it went from there to the L-1011. That was a great airplane, probably one of the best engineered airplanes ever flown. And then I went from there to the DC-8 and flew it for a while, and then went back as a captain on actually the MD-80, and the Delta bought the MD-90, which was a high-performance MD-88, and flew it as an instructor and evaluator, and then decided I liked international flying. And I went directly from it. Normally you go domestic, and I went on to Boeing 767, but I got an assignment in Atlanta, and very junior, and commuting was an experience being married. We did not have children at that time, and so it was good, but and Laura was working, and she had been a stewardess with American, and she quit when I moved to Wichita. But anyhow, we tolerated it. She's been a wonderful wife, related to aviation, which is a lot of challenge. But she always jokes, we've been married almost 50 years, but half the time I was gone. So we've been married 25 years. You know? But anyhow, that we went to, I was flying international on the 767. My first job was, the first flight on the B767 after training was to Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. Delta just got the route, and they weren't really familiar with all the procedures, and I studied, I think I memorized all the maps between here and Rio, because there were no emergency airfields to land a big airplane like that. And going down there, the Portuguese, they spoke English, but and then the first experience was the airport there. The weather reports were for 2 airports, which is really unusual, rare. So just to get the weather for landing was interesting. But anyhow, I enjoyed flying that. We used to go to Sao Paulo and then spend a night and then go to Rio de Janeiro, and we had a day and a half there, and ate a lot of garlic chicken there. And then from there, went to the MD-11. Well, I was an instructor on the 767 also, an evaluator, and then went to the L-1011, not the L-1011, the MD-11, and that was my last assignment I retired off. But on each of those airplanes, flying the MD-88, MD-90, I flew to all the kind of, I don't want to say respectable, but all the airports that were cities in America, from the Northwest, Northeast, South, everywhere, and all kind of weather conditions, icy and everything. It was quite an experience. But 767 was a good airplane. It went into the smaller airports in Europe, and so I got into like Salzburg and Dublin and all that. But then when I got on the MD-11, that was Delta Big Jet, as we joked. And from there I went all over the world, Tokyo to Tel Aviv, Cairo, Bombay. I had a lot of flying in Bombay and London, and my last flight was from London to Atlanta. And they treated me wonderfully on that, the hotel, arrival, the departure. And when I left London, they gave me the water cannon, going out of there, which I thought was nice out of there. But the hotel, we had a wonderful suite overlooking the sea, and then coming into Atlanta the same way, the water cannons and all that, greeting and retirement. And so I had a wonderful flying career with Delta. I always said I was happy they loaned me that airplane to go fly. It was a electronic jet, truly. Well, the 767 was too, and the MD-90 was advanced as well, but the technical aspects of the MD-11, they redid the DC-10 in the era of the new Boeing 767, so it had all the technological gee whiz stuff on it, and we flew transatlantic, trans-Pacific, and over the Arctic Circle, and it was a great airplane. Flew with a lot of great crew members, as was in the B-52 and the other airplanes. People that they say the basic element, one of the basic instincts is survival, and you know, so you learn your job so you can live. And they talk about pilots. Most pilots, I mean, all pilots, they want to live, so they learn the job and do it, you know, as best they can. But there might be some aberrations in there where some guys got addicted in every profession, you know, but they're discovered and treated quickly, you know, and gently. But anyhow, in all my flying, it was done with wonderful people and wonderful companies, Air Force, and airplanes. I never had any real scary things to speak about. I've had some emergencies and done them, treated them, but they were all rather uneventful. They say a good pilot has an equal number of takeoffs and landings. And you know, another saying about good pilots is, you know, you can walk away from the accident, but the best pilot can reuse the airplane. So anyhow, that's kind of it in a nutshell. Did I leave anything out?
No, I don't think so. It's very interesting. Your career was extremely interesting. Looking back on it in your military service, what do you think your military service taught you that you used in your civilian life and in your life after the military?
Well, I was given a unique position of being standardization, evaluation. So all through my flying career, I respected rules, and I disrespected pilots that as an evaluator I saw, and being a crew member, I wasn't always instructing, that to see how some pilots did things more lackadaisical. So I don't like to say in my home life with Laura that it taught me to be a perfectionist, but sometimes I get grief about wanting things, you know, a certain way, the right way and the wrong way and whatever, but that was probably it. The other thing is working with people. You know, in the crew, in the cockpit, you're very close, you're feet apart from other people in there. And I had some challenges, particularly on the more senior airplanes. I flew with pilots that have been captains, and then got, because of flying cutbacks and whatever, they're now co-pilots. And so they, but that was rare, but I did have a few of that. But dealing with people, I think was very important in that. So that paid off very well in all of life. But I think, looking back on it, we were talking this morning, I mean, ethnically, racially, I was just brought up, that was not an issue in my house, in my parents' house. So, at home, in school, my early days in high school, whatever, I had a lot of friends that were all backgrounds. And I think being able to appreciate people as they are and what they are was very important.
Right.
So, working with everybody and respecting orders, you know, although we never thought of it as that in the military, that was our job, you know,
Right.
what was described. So.
Right, exactly. Is there anything you feel that we haven't discussed or that you would like to discuss to add further?
I wrote down a lot of jokes I'd like to drop. You know, the cockpit is a great place to spread the word, you know, and I married a gal that doesn't really like me to tell a lot of military jokes or anything, you know, but yeah, no, I think I'm happy to have the opportunity to tell it and talk about it, and I'm sure I left out some very important things that it was a long, interesting career and experiences, but I'm glad I got to relate some of it.
Right, well, we certainly appreciate you giving your time and giving your interview, and certainly appreciate your service.
Thank you.
Our freedom is never just given to us. someone
Yeah.
always has to stand
Yeah.
in our stead, and we appreciate you being willing to stand between the United States and her enemies.
Yeah,
And
thank
we
you
appreciate
for
your service so
recognizing
much.
that. And I'm so happy and proud of Laura being in the Daughters of the American Revolution, and for all that you're doing for leading in this endeavor, and that Vietnam 50-year memorial and recognition of Laura for her award
Right.
was super. And but I'm learning more and more every day about what you all are doing. And I was in Rotary and the president of the Rotary Club, but you gals are leading a different direction in honoring our fallen patriots. And that's, I told Laura, I said, I don't know, 200 years from now, I don't think they're going to call me a patriot. Nuclear bomber pilot. I had a cousin in San Francisco that during my training in B-52s and whatever, that was during the Haight-Ashbury days, and she worked for the Office of Economic Opportunity, and she kind of shows the reception that we got after Vietnam. But she, when we'd meet, she's been a very close cousin. She's 5 days younger than me, and we still relate. But during that time period, she was a hippie. Even though she worked for the government, she coordinated the Methodist Church and the hippies to attend services. But when we would meet, and I was in California, I had to, you know, dress discreetly, and we met secretively, because if any of her friends ever found out that I was a nuclear bomber pilot, that would have been a death knell, not death knell, but anyway,
Right.
she would have been ostracized.
Right.
But so today, I'm so happy that y'all are recognizing that time period and kind of shadowing that and covering that up. But so thank you again.
Well,
The
no,
Daughter of
thank
the American
you.
Revolution. Thank you,
Yeah,
gals.
well, as you know, we are working in conjunction with the Library of Congress on the Veterans History Project.
Yeah.
And they have created a pin, which I'd like to present to you, and only veterans who have given their oral histories
Yeah.
get those pins. So if you happen to have it and see another veteran that has that
Yeah.
on, you will know that his interview is also in the Library of Congress, where yours will be. And also our chapter of Mary Isham Keek would like to give you this certificate of appreciation for giving your interview to us and allowing us to put that with our archives. And then we have a lapel pin. These were given to me by another Vietnam veteran, and he worked with veterans anyway, and he asked that we give these out. But it's a Vietnam veteran's lapel pin
Yeah.
for
Wonderful,
you to
yeah.
have. And so,
Thank you.
again, we appreciate your service, and we thank you for your time and being willing to give your interview for us.
I really appreciate your help in doing this.
Well, you're
So,
welcome.
thank you. Enjoyed it.